Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by HarperCollins Australia.
Last year, I had the pleasure of appearing on an author panel with our next guest, who spoke about her debut novel, Melaleuca. And as she spoke, it was clear to me that this was a book that needed to be written and published. Listeners, my name is Cassie Hamer. I'm an author, and I'm so delighted to be your guest host for today, speaking with Angie Faye Martin about her suspenseful and atmospheric crime novel, Melaleuca, with its potent themes around racism and injustice in rural Australia. It's a story told through the lens of a gutsy Indigenous protagonist. Police procedural meets historical crime fiction. Angie, welcome to the podcast. The reception to this book has been fantastic. You've hit bestseller lists, you're doing events all over the place, and the reviews are incredibly positive. Does it feel like you're living the dream at the moment?
Look, I'm pretty blown away by the reception to Melaleuca in the best way possible. You mentioned the panel we were on last year, Cassie, and that just feels like a world away. I was just such a little newbie, so naive. I still feel like that in many ways, but so it's just the last, 2 months since publication, almost 3, has been an absolute roller coaster. Lots of publicity and readers letting me know what they thought of the book, which is just wonderful, to hear people engaging with it and relating to the characters and the themes.
It really is testament to the fact that there's an incredible hunger among the reading public for First Nations stories and First Nations perspectives. So let's talk a little bit about the story itself. Our main character is Renee Taylor, and she's an Indigenous Brisbane detective in her late 20s. And she's come home temporarily to the small Queensland town of Gurunga to care for her mum, who's frail with severe arthritis. Fair to say that Renee's not that happy about being back home. She's relegated to constable status on general duties. But on her third day, the body of a young Indigenous woman, brutally beaten to death, is found in a creek bed on the fringes of town. And Renee really wants to investigate this one, doesn't she? What kind of a person is Renee?
So Renee is quite a fierce person. She's rather stubborn, very headstrong. She's one of those people that are quite tough on the outside, but when you get to know her, she's really vulnerable inside. She's got a really big heart. She's very caring. Although she grudgingly returns to the little country town of Gurunga, she does have a strong sense of duty towards her mother. And what I really enjoyed writing with Melaleuca was actually the interactions between Renee, who's Aboriginal, and her mother, who's non-Indigenous. That was a fun kind of dynamic to write about. They share banter and dry humour. So it was really enjoyable to get to know Renee. I was pushed by my editor to kind of make her a bit more, take more risks. I think I was relating a bit too much to Renee. She was a bit too much like myself at certain points, and my editor said, "She's not you, Angie." I was like, oh, that released me in a way, because then I would step out of that character zone and push her to take more risks, which you need when you're writing a detective, right? Or a constable. It was really quite freeing when I was writing her, because I could get her to do things that I wouldn't do in real life. I think a lot of writers do that when they're writing. They have their protagonists take on, the villains and do more really courageous things that I would never do. But yeah, through her, I also explore, the deeper themes around racism, and just little microaggressions and attacks can slowly erode your confidence. And yeah, her interactions with the other deputies and Stacey, the other people around town, that was also fun to write. So it's been lovely hearing how people have engaged with Renee, and I'm looking forward to, writing more about her.
I read an article yesterday where I think you said that you wrote this book from a wound and not a scar. And I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about that. I'm sensing there that you're alluding to the themes around identity in this book, where
Mm,
Renee has a white mum and an
mm,
Indigenous dad, which is one of the things that I suppose that you do share in common. Is that what you were
mm.
talking about in relation to the scar and not the wound?
Yeah, so I think in order to get to a point where I could write Melaleuca, I felt like I had to process a lot of my own kind of emotional traumas from when I was growing up. I mean, I don't want to be too dramatic about it, and I don't talk about it too much publicly, but I had very severe depression and suffered from really bad anxiety in my early 20s. And I had to undergo a lot of therapy and a lot of talk therapy in order to understand my place in the world and understand what was going on for me. And through that process, I think I reached a place where I could just view the world from a more compassionate place. So after healing myself and going through a process of forgiving people, just, I guess, getting to a better place, myself, where you can comfortably look around and not hold so much anger or animosity. I had to get to that place before I started writing Melaleuca, or actually, writing Melaleuca was part of that healing process. Someone asked me recently why I think Melaleuca is connecting with readers, and I think it's because I have processed the trauma and the pain that I went through in my early 20s and got to a place where I could look at everyone with more compassion and do that healing work. And I think the way some of the characters come through in Melaleuca, you can see that tenderness there.
It's fair to say that Renee is definitely a woman who is on a journey, and she has experienced that sort of micro racism and more overt forms of, I suppose, bullying, because she's had a background in the town of having a white mum who wasn't particularly well off. And so she was sort of bullied for not having, the best clothes and the best house. And her Indigenous heritage is something that she's yet to explore. And we'll come back to this a bit later on, because you leave us with a really delicious little snippet at the end that suggests which path the next book might go in. But I've heard you speak quite a lot about your dad and his influence over this book. Can you just tell me a
Mm.
little bit about him, and in particular, what was the spark that really got this story going? And it was something that happened to your dad.
Yeah, so before I go on to dad, I'll just reflect a little bit more about Renee's personality in terms of her mum and dad. So I have drawn a lot from my own experiences in that I do have a non-Indigenous mum and an Aboriginal dad. And for a little while, my parents got divorced when I was 15, and I did actually just live with mum for a while. And during that period, we did struggle a bit financially. We moved down to the city and we moved away from the rest of the family. And I think a lot of Renee's experiences in the book are shaped by that period of my life where she feels like she is a little bit cut off from the rest of the community. So it's not entirely me, but I've drawn on chapters of my life and feelings that I've gone through over my life to harness Renee's emotions. Now, my dad, he is a very proud, strong Cooma man, and he has raised me to be in touch with country, respect elders, traditional culture. He himself, though, has been removed and suffered from the effects of loss of culture and colonization and absolute poverty. So, dad grew up on the Charleville Yamba, which is a fringe camp, and that is the setting for the 1960s timeline in Melaleuca. We talk about intergenerational trauma a bit in my family. Dad doesn't actually like that term too much, but I can see how it's filtered down through my family. We do have strong culture. We love it. We're proud. But this, I think we're still yet to understand the effects of how removal from traditional lands, that would have been my great grandparents, growing up in the camps and the threat of stolen generations, that would have been like my grandparents and a little bit my dad's experiences. And then trying to get by after the 1967 referendum, and this is more my dad's experience, trying to get work and, employment, education. There were the rights movements. Dad and his family started up the legal services. Nan was on all the health boards up there. So we've gone through all these stages in history of fighting and healing, and I think we're yet to fully understand the trauma that's affected us as individuals. And maybe I've explored that a little bit in Melaleuca.
You have 100%. I think I'm so glad that you've mentioned that dual timeline aspect of the book because it's so important. And just to fill in listeners who may not yet have read the book, how it works is that while Renee is investigating the murder of the young Indigenous woman, she also discovers that there were two young Aboriginal girls who went missing from Gurunga in the 1960s. And what she sees is that the woman who has died in the year 2000 story is wearing the exact same necklace that was worn by one of the girls who went missing in the 1960s. So Renee realizes that there has to be a connection with the recent disappearance and the historical one. And she goes down that thread. And that's how we meet the other main character, I suppose, in this book, who is Caroline, young Indigenous girl growing up in the 1960s on the Yamba. And those scenes are so atmospheric and interesting. And I'm just wondering if you can paint a little bit more of a picture of what life was like to grow up in those
Yeah.
camps.
So Dad's actually written a little bit about this himself. He enjoys writing, and I've also just asked him lots and lots of questions over the years about what it was like to grow up on those camps. And what I wanted to portray in Melaleuca was that often these people were, their humanity was really stripped from them. It was taken away in many ways, but they also still loved and cared for each other so sincerely. So Dad would often talk about how they'd huddle around in the hut, or his grandmother would smoke them with sandalwood. They still clung on to some traditional ways. They would still have campfires and go fishing, and they'd still sit around and have cups of tea. And I wanted that humanity and love and care to shine through in the scenes between Caroline and her big sister Millie and Pa Quincy on the camp, because it's so beautiful. There were obviously, there was real violence that was going on, there was hardship. Dad talks a little bit about how the locals from the town would sometimes come out and just terrorize them whenever the Aboriginal men on the camp, they would leave to work on the stations, on the pastoral stations, and the people in town would find out that there were no men to protect the women and children, and they would come out and just drive around like drunken hoodlums shouting. My grandmother would get all the kids inside, and lock the doors. So there was that going on. There was obviously this external threat, but it didn't take away just the love and the nurturing that continued. And the stories, even though a lot of the culture and the language was stripped away, some of the stories continued, and the connection to the land definitely continued.
I've read a little bit of your dad's blog, and there are some really beautiful but heartbreaking bits that he includes, like about his cousins eating red dirt because they were
Mm.
just so hungry, and the dirt was something that would fill them up. And I'm hearing what you're saying about how what you tried to do in the book and what you do in the book is balance the devastation of that with the
Mhm.
love and the humanity. And I'm wondering, how conscious were you of creating a book that I suppose is challenging to the reader in some ways, but at the end of the day is a form of entertainment as well?
Mm. Well, I guess you trust your instincts a little bit. I trust my team, my editing team. I trust my pre-readers before it even gets to the editing team. So my sister and my cousins read it. In terms of the research, you also develop a bit of a sixth sense of what's okay to go near and what still needs to be private, and work through a little bit more. So I actually wrote a lot of Melaleuca when I was down in Melbourne during the COVID lockdowns, and I would call Dad and Nan when she was still with us, and they would be up in Oakey, and they'd put me on speakerphone, and it was a way for us to, we were obviously missing each other because we couldn't travel. They were isolating voluntarily because they were too scared of getting COVID, but I was obviously, could go for a little walk around my house, so I was lonely. So we just put each other on speakerphone, and, we'd talk about the old times. Nan would tell little stories, but she was much more reluctant to go into any hard issues. And, the reasons are obvious there. She's just too hard for her to talk about some things. Dad, I think, is a little bit more forthcoming, as you would have seen in his writing. He talks about probably with a lot of humor, actually. And part of me feels like it's my responsibility because I have also gone through a bit more processing, maybe because I'm just the next generation, that I can carry a bit more and share a bit more and speak about a bit more. And I think I had their blessing in going there and sharing a little bit more about what the camps were like and what it's felt like for people.
Would you say that that love of storytelling is something that comes from your grandmothers, I believe? Is that right?
Absolutely. So both my mum's mum and my dad's mum were storytellers. So Nan would often tell lots of stories, often ghost stories. We, as little kids, we would beg her to tell us scary stories. I don't know why, we just loved being terrorized. It was just entertainment. She'd tell some really sweet ones too. Like, she grew up on the Moree mission and she loved telling us how when she was a little kid, her and her friends would insist that the American soldiers passing through the mission would give them coins. And because they'd stand and they'd block the road and they'd say, "This is our land, you need to pay us." You just talk about how they're just dressed in, rags and no shoes on, but they'd insist these American soldiers would pay. She told that story a lot. And then my mum's mum, she was actually a very talented poet. She didn't share much though. I've got a diary and we've shared it around the family. Some of the poems are just absolutely stunning and beautiful. Maybe one day I'll have mum's blessing to share some of those. She nurtured us kids to have a love for fiction. She was the kind of grandma who would patiently sit with us while we were doing our homework and really encouraged that exploration and creativity, and weren't wealthy, they weren't poor, they were farmers, but they spent most of their money on traveling. So they actually did like the Trans-Siberian Railway line. They went to Nepal for their honeymoon in like the 60s or 50s, I don't know. They were very adventurous people. And so my Nana Lorna really encouraged us to explore, get out and explore different cultures and
Mhm.
have a love for reading and do the extra homework with us. So it wasn't just about school. It was you read also when you're outside of school.
It's so interesting because you clearly have this rich vein of family storytelling and adventure, and yet your career initially didn't take that path. You went into public policy, spent quite a bit of time in government, did a master's in anthropology. So I'm wondering what turned you into writing fiction? Was there a particular moment or experience?
I think a little bit of desperation, to be honest. I needed a creative outlet to explore what was going on in my head. So I chose the sensible route because I was raised to be practical, like I said before, we weren't rich people, and the idea of studying creative arts or something was just not happening with my parents. Like, unfortunately, that was a hobby you would do on the side if you could get a sensible job. So I followed in my sister's footsteps. She went down to Canberra. She got a cadetship, and I also applied for a cadetship in the health department. So I think there was still that want to. I did public health, so I still had this urge to lift up community in whatever way I was doing. I had a strong belief in public health, and even back then, a little bit of health promotion and storytelling and healing. But yeah, I was very practical. Stayed in government contract work for a long time, policy development, which I enjoyed. But then I just about 10 years ago, I first started, getting the seed for Melaleuca. And you asked me before, and I didn't actually answer your question. So I didn't even realize that this seed of abandonment, the theme of dad being abandoned by his grandfather had stayed with me. So, like we talk about family and intergenerational trauma and stuff.
Mm.
So, when I was about 8 years old, I remember my dad reached out to he had lost his dad. So my grandfather died tragically in a car accident the year before I was born. My dad was the head of a big Aboriginal family for a long time in Toowoomba, and a lot of people looked to him for support during the 80s and then the 90s. And I think dad felt a lot of responsibility and a bit of pressure. And so he reached out to his non-Indigenous grandfather who was a rich white man down here in Brisbane. He'd only ever sent money to my grandfather. And so it was acknowledged, but it was very distant. So, and Dad's sent him a letter and like, would you like to catch up? And he flat rejected him. And I always wondered as a little 8-year-old, seeing my dad get rejected and wondering what that was all about. Why did he not want to know our family? At that point, I thought, well, we're just a big, happy Aboriginal family. Why wouldn't that man down in Brisbane want to know us? And was it about money? Did he think we were going to ask him money? And then later on, I started thinking, well, I guess it's because we're a bunch of black fellas. And now that I'm growing up a bit, maybe he didn't want to take on, the responsibility of all of us. So I think just as a kid, I've always been close to Dad, and I watched him struggle a bit with that rejection over the years. And I think if you read Melaleuca, there's a bit of a seed of abandonment that comes through. And I can't talk about it too much more. I'll give, it's a crime fiction, so can't give away any spoilers. But that fracture in families is a theme that runs through it.
Definitely. And that sense of prejudice and corruption comes through quite strongly as well, and especially how racism does influence the justice system, particularly in relation to the storyline around the two missing girls. And you've just spoken a little bit about the real life inspiration of your dad and that awful rejection by his grandfather. But I understand there was also a bit of real life inspiration behind the missing girls. That's somewhat a little bit based on something that happened.
So when I was also a little kid, there was a real life case around Toowoomba of two nurses who were backpacking tragically were murdered. And I remember that the community was quite scared about it and no one knew who it was, but it was quite obvious it was someone local to the community because of the way the women were found. And that, suspicion of it could have been someone we know. Out of respect for the families, I don't like speaking too much about that, only from my own experience, and that is there was fear in the community. And I guess as a little kid, just knowing that the adults, they'd turn the news off because they wouldn't want the kids to get scared when they saw it. Another thing I didn't realize had affected me, but came out when I started writing a crime thriller. I was actually just reading too much Gillian Flynn at the time. I started writing Melaleuca and I thought I could do a crime novel. And then what could I, draw from? And then all these obviously demons that had still been lurking in my subconscious started arising. And there you go. That's how Melaleuca came into the world.
And it's such a beautiful title. And for those who haven't seen it, the cover is so evocative. It has these beautiful green tones. It's a bushland setting. There's a lovely creek going through it, but sort of slightly creepy vibes as well. But I'm interested to know why the Melaleuca tree and what is its symbolism in the book?
When I first got the idea down in Carnegie, where I was living down in Melbourne at the time, I was actually walking around a lot with my husband, processing what I was experiencing at work, and I'd babble a lot, and he would be, oh yeah, he just, let me work through whatever I was going through. And there were lots of Melaleuca trees, paperbark trees, and I will remember on these long walks I would just pick the bark off, and as we were walking, I would, slowly tear it apart because it felt so nice. And I guess these ideas just emerged. I started telling my husband, oh, I could write a crime novel or something. And then thinking the metaphor of the paperbark and people's personalities and the layers of people's personalities and whether or not you ever really know someone, and authenticity was a real theme for me. So a lot of people think that Melaleuca is more the oils or the flowers. It was actually the bark itself, which was the original idea. And the working title of the story was The Paperbark Trees for a long time. And then as I got to writing it and got more and more into the theme and researching and looking at the tree itself, I drew on the other elements and the oil, which is symbolic of healing. And at one point, Caroline swims in a a tea tree, which is Melaleuca, tea tree stained lake. And she talks a little bit in that scene about how she's constantly healing from the aggression of the world. And then what else have I? Oh, the blossoms as well. So the scent of the blossoms takes, well, that's in the very first scene. So when the woman smells the blossoms, it's
Mm.
like her last taste of sweet life before.
The setting is beautifully rendered and it is unashamedly Queensland. You know, it's a town of heat and snakes and pubs and storms and backyard chooks. Is that the Queensland of your childhood?
Absolutely. So I grew up in Oki, and for a long time I thought I'm not going to tell anyone that this book's based on Oki. And then it was just so, as I was writing, it was just so clearly based on Oki. So I just even acknowledged it in the book because I thought, oh, well, it's nice. So that's about 200 kilometers west of Brisbane. And when I was about 11 or 12, I couldn't wait to get out of there because I was thinking, oh, I want to move to the city and be cool and that. But I had the best childhood, just like all the little things in Melaleuca, like the kids playing down by the creek, that was my summer. Swinging off the ropes into the creek, and I have a scene where Renee climbs up a silo. Like me and my cousins, we were so naughty. We would dare each other to climb up the silos so we could just enjoy the views across the town. I'm really grateful for being brought up in a country town. It wasn't my traditional lands, it's Jarowair country, but it's beautiful and just so many very fond memories of my brother, down by the creek, always daring each other to do silly things, my older sister. It was so nice, back before iPads and iPhones, and mum would just say, go out and, have fun so she could get the washing done. And we would spend literally all day outside running amok. Holidays, our cousins would visit, so we'd have more people, to get up to mischief with. But we never got hurt or anything. I mean, I think I had stitches in my chin because I fell over the handlebars of my bike once, but nothing.
There's a lovely sort of sense of nostalgia in the book, but it's not sentimental because Renee is sort of constantly on edge. And there is this idea that the smallness of a country town is both its blessing and its curse. You know, the blessing is that everyone knows you, and the curse is also that everyone knows you and knows your business. I always get this sense that Renee just for a lot of different reasons, never quite feels at home in her home.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true of Renee's character. And I suppose I've drawn on my feelings of, moving around a lot, moving from Oakey to Brisbane and then Canberra and Melbourne. Now I'm back here in Redcliffe, which I hope to stay. But, a yearning to know a place, maybe that even comes from a little bit deeper, being removed from traditional lands, which is just feels impractical now to return to, even though we won native title and everything. So just being grounded, it's something that we all crave, I think, to be grounded in a place.
And this idea of knowing exactly who you are, because for a lot of the book, as I mentioned, she's not particularly connected to her Indigenous ancestry. She
Mm.
knows a lot more about her mum and her background. So there is a sense that there's some unresolved issues there. And I think you've spoken in interviews yourself about how this has been something for you as well to work through in your life. And I'm wondering if it's not too personal, where do you find yourself on that journey at the moment?
Well, for me, I can't speak on behalf of all Aboriginal people, but it's it's always just like an issue for being Aboriginal. Like, you know, I wish it was just a more relaxed state of being. And normally it is when you're with your family, like you can just forget about it. But when you're, at school, do you tick the box or do you not tick the box? And when I say the box, as in, are you Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander? When you go into a medical appointment, you're forced to confront, whether or not you're Aboriginal. For a little period of time, I decided, no, stuff it, I'm not even going to do that. But sometimes there's not even an undecided. And I think that was in my early 20s as well, when I was feeling really lost and confused. But it's like you're either not black enough to be black, but you're not white enough to be white. And sometimes you just feel aggression from all angles. there's like an expectation from some people that if you're Aboriginal, you should speak your language, you know a lot about culture. And some people even ask that, trying to be nice or friendly. You know, we've got a lot of friends from overseas, and when they find out I'm Aboriginal, so what words can you say? And, you know, and then you feel embarrassed because, like, well, I can't. And then it's like, why? Well, because we weren't allowed to. It carries such a heavy weight, you know, there's so much explaining behind it that most of the time you don't feel like doing. So
Mm.
even though it's asked with such good intent, they just want to understand a little bit more about your culture or your history. It's like, well, I'm Aboriginal, but still don't have much of that. So with Melaleuca, I think I wanted to give voice to being Aboriginal, but not necessarily having all the culture, as Renee does, or the language, but providing the context for that. So non-Indigenous people would, it's like an invitation to empathize, I suppose that's how I
Mm.
describe
Mm.
it in many ways, because it's so complex. It's complex for me, and it's also complex for non-Indigenous people to understand because sometimes they just don't know. And actually, one of the ways I've communicated that is through Renee and Stacey's interactions. So they end up becoming quite close. And I think Stacey is representative of so many, you know,
Mm.
natured people in my life who really, really want to help and do good. And you do appreciate that. But at the same time, Renee's a bit of a bitch to her because she just like can't handle it. She gets overwhelmed. It's like, oh, at one point she's like, go away, Stacey, I don't want a bloody bicky or something. And that's just a little window into the dynamic. It's also a way of saying, you know, sorry, we get a bit cranky sometimes, but it's just because there's so much going on there. So hard to explain.
It's such a nuanced and layered representation, I suppose, of what it is like to have mixed heritage of
Mm,
Indigenous and non-Indigenous, which I think, you know, as you said, it is a beautiful invitation to empathize, which are words that I love. And you mentioned earlier that it took about 10 years to get this novel to
yeah.
publication phase. And I suppose that maybe it's a book that needed that length of time
Mhm.
because it is so
Yeah.
layered and nuanced. But I'm wondering if you can speak about something that seemed to be a pivotal moment in that journey, which is when you're awarded a fellowship with your now publisher, HQ Fiction. Can you tell me what that
Mm.
fellowship was and how it helped you?
Yeah, it was just incredible. So that was back in 2019. I think I got the call on Tuesday night that I'd been shortlisted and, you know, one of three. And then Friday, I found out I had won it. And I was just blown away. I just remember my heart expanding, just thinking, oh my God, I finally, you know, someone has enjoyed the story. Like I always had faith in it. I always just knew it was a good story and it would go somewhere, but just knowing that I had a chance. So the fellowship was First Nations HarperCollins Commercial Fiction Fellowship. I had to write 70,000 words of a draft and I submitted that. And when I won it, I was assigned a mentor with the wonderful Amy Matthews over in Adelaide on Kaurna Country. And I got to work with her for a year and she would read my manuscript and really meet me where I was at in my writing journey. So I'd only done a 5-week creative writing course through the Australian Writers Centre, which was incredible. And I learned a lot about point of views. That was my biggest, gap in my knowledge there. But Amy would just give me these little tips along the way. So I had a postgraduate master's in anthropology, so I could write nonfiction, but I didn't understand the craft of writing. Naturally, I knew storytelling from my grandmothers, but the craft of writing, Amy just really met me where I was at and would read the story. It was mainly being listened to, being heard, and just having someone respond to my manuscripts. Then after that, I worked with Jo Mackay, my editor, who I'm still working with at the moment, and she would guide me through the next phase of writing the book. And it was just to actually be seen by a professional editor who could just cut through things in such precision. I remember her understanding of the plot because I would get all caught up and I'd be like, I can't, you know, I'd go for walks around and around the block and I would just get so frustrated. And then I'd describe to her what I was trying to do. And she'd be like, I can see what you're doing. I was like, are you serious? Because I don't even know what I'm trying to do myself. She didn't have the answers, but she would listen to me long enough for me to figure it out myself. And so then I got the contract. I don't know, was that 3 years ago now? Yeah, it just feels wonderful to be at this point. Obviously, there were times I got a little bit disenchanted and frustrated. The wait felt a bit long at certain points. But now I'm so grateful that it did take that long, because I realized I also needed to build my own life to be able to engage in the publicity and the promotion of the book, because that is just a whole nother area. I mean, there's one thing to write the book, and then you need, as you know, Cassie, because you brought your own stranger to the table, to the world this year, you need to be able to be on panels and podcasts. And, I was just hiding away in my room writing it for a long time. And then the next stage came. So the fact it took so long meant I could simultaneously work on getting ready for the promotional side of things.
I think that's something that's not spoken about enough, the importance of having a very strong sense of yourself and understanding of your own work come publication time. But there are a lot of aspiring writers who listen to this podcast, and I'm wondering if you can recall, either from that period of the fellowship or at any other time, what do you think is the best piece of writing advice that you've received, or the best piece of writing wisdom that you like to impart to people?
I don't actually get writer's block. And I think it's because I don't put that much pressure on myself. And I think a lot of writers, from what I hear, they put pressure on themselves. And well, it took me 10 years to write a book, so you can probably see why. But I just think you do have to sit down and write, or you have to make the space for writing. But if the scenes and the words aren't coming, that's okay. So if you're feeling a bit burnt out, which we all do, or you're feeling a bit tired, and you sit at your computer and you don't get much done, don't beat yourself up. Like, it's a creative pursuit. Unfortunately, sometimes it turns into your job and you have to make money, and that's just the reality of it. But don't beat yourself up if it doesn't come. And so along with that advice, I also really trust the drafting process. So I can be crippled by perfection in other parts of my life, but I refuse to allow that into my writing work, and I trust the drafting process. So especially during my first drafts, I will sit down, and I think when I started writing my next book, I thought, I'm just going to write complete crap today. I just allowed myself to I'm just going to write whatever comes out and absolutely liberate myself. And then it's like, tomorrow I'll come back and I'll see how that sounds or what that looks like. But for today, I'm just going to let it flow. More often than not, sometimes it is crap, but more often than not, it's pretty good. Or there's some, little bits that you can work with. Or even if you have written a heap of crap, sometimes there's just like a little pearl in there that you can pull out that's come, from the stream of consciousness or whatever.
I completely agree with what you're saying, that self-doubt and writer's block are often one and the same thing. And I think I also read or heard somewhere that sometimes you adopt a special outfit for writing. Is that right?
Yeah. So I actually change into, when I'm editing, I change into like a more officey kind of outfit. Like the kind of stuff I used to wear in government. And then when I'm writing, I let myself wear more relaxed, hippie, kind of put my lipstick on, and just helps me to change persona a little bit. And that's my sign to myself, I'm going to be free today. And, as you can see, today I'm in writing phase of my next book. So I'm wearing my scarf and a headband that doesn't match and a little bit of lipstick, because I'm letting myself be a bit more free today.
I love that. And speaking of next books, I'm really hoping that we are going to see Renee pop up in the next book.
Yeah, so it's a sequel. I'm calling it Sandalwood. Hopefully that gets across the line with the publisher. And Renee will go a little bit further west to solve a whole new crime. And this next one will also be a bit more about her relationship with her dad. So we'll explore Aboriginal culture a little bit more. And I can't say anything else because I'll give it away. But
I'm delighted to hear that she is coming back and that you're going to delve into this a little further. And just to finish on, I suppose that given there is going to be such a connection between the first and the second book, I'm wondering if you can tell me, what is it that you want readers to take away from your stories?
I think it's a window into maybe a world that hasn't been shown too much on mainstream media. So, firstly, the life on the camps. I think there's been a little bit more about the reserves and the missions and the stolen generations, and deservedly so. Maybe Sally Morgan wrote a bit about the camps, I think, over in Perth, but not too much in Queensland. And the other thing is just the experiences of an Aboriginal woman like myself who sometimes gets a bit confused and frustrated by her identity. I think, my nieces now are encountering similar things. Like, do you tick the box at school? And you try to give them a sense of strong culture, take them to community events. And yeah, I hope that they're a little bit more liberated by everyone just having a bit better understanding, so it's not as hard for them when they grow up.
I love that you're going to keep writing about it so that we can all learn, not just your beautiful nieces and nephews. But Angie, congratulations again on a fantastic book and a really successful launch to what I hope is going to be a very long writing career.
Oh, thank you so much, Cassie. I have really enjoyed this chat. Thank you.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading!